In the unforgiving arena of the UFC's octagon, warriors are tested and mixed martial arts legends are born. Through those trials, a select few rise above the rest. These aren't just fighters, they're modern-day gladiators, the true masters of combat. From submission artists to striking specialists, each of them have etched their names in history with their journeys paved in blood and sweat. Join us as we pay homage to the greatest of the greats. From the pioneers who opened doors to today's champions, they're all here. As we dive into this countdown, let the debates begin. Get ready to dissect and deliberate as we give you MMA Junkie's 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time.
Few quotes in UFC history have rung more true than the iconic phrase, "There's only one Conor McGregor." McGregor made his promotional debut in April 2013 with some hype around his name due to being a two-division champion for Cage Warriors. It didn't take him long to declare his intentions to repeat that same feat on MMA's biggest stage. An argument can be made that no fighter has ever had the rise to the top unfold more seamlessly than McGregor. The brash Irishman rocketed his way through the featherweight ranks in unprecedented fashion, leading him into one of the biggest championship fights in UFC history against the great Jose Aldo at UFC 194 in December 2015. Under the most pressure and with the most eyeballs on him, McGregor delivered in a way few could have only fathomed. He knocked out Aldo in just 13 seconds for the fastest title fight finish in UFC history, and from there, his trajectory was altered forever. McGregor's star power only went up. His memorable two-fight series with Nate Diaz broke pay-per-view records. He became the first simultaneous UFC two-division champion with a dazzling performance against Eddie Alvarez at UFC 205. That went on to be a trendsetter by moving to boxing to face Floyd Mayweather in a bout that led him to financial security beyond his wildest dreams. If McGregor's story ended there, it would have been the stuff of fairy tales. But every great rise seems to follow with flaw, and McGregor's have been there for the world to witness. The Notorious has won just one fight since defeating Eddie Alvarez for his second title in November 2016. He faltered in an all-time grudge match with Khabib Nurov, then suffered a pair of losses to conclude his trilogy with Dustin Poirier, the latter of which saw him sustain a life-altering leg break. A consistent stream of outside-the-octagon controversies have become a crucial part of McGregor's story, and left mystery about his fighting future and what more he can still accomplish. Even if he never wins again, however, McGregor's initial UFC run and ability to redefine what star power in MMA truly means makes him a no-brainer selection as one of the top 30 greatest of all time in UFC history.
The UFC's octagon has had many tenants over its 30 years, but that sacred ground first belonged to one man.
This is my house. I built it.
Royce Gracie, the number 14 fighter on our list of the 30 greatest fighters in UFC history. November 12, 1993, UFC 1. Royce Gracie walked into the octagon via the Gracie train. He was just over 6 feet tall, about 170 pounds. Lean, but definitely not muscular. Did it matter? Heck no. Gracie just absolutely buzzsawed through a one-night, 8-man open-weight tourney that had no rules. In just over 5 minutes of work, Gracie submitted a pro boxer, a shoot fighter, and a savate fighter. Gracie won $50,000 that night, but it wasn't about the money, it was about the reckoning. We now knew which martial art was the best one of them all, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And to be more specific, Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. The word was out, if you wanted to win a fight, you better learn BJJ. Gracie went on to win 2 more tournaments, UFC 2 and 4. And UFC 2 was a 16-man tournament. How crazy is that? 4 wins in one night. In today's modern game, 4-0 is a great year. All told, Gracie's first UFC run left a trail of destruction that included the following: a record of 11-0-1. All 11 wins were finishes, 10 submissions, 5 different submissions, and 1 TKO. 3 tournament wins, 2 wins over UFC future Hall of Famers, all that, and he did it in 18 months. After his legendary run in the first UFCs, Gracie went on to compete in Japan mostly, before one final outing in the UFC versus Matt Hughes at UFC 60. In 2003, Gracie was inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. In this sport, you know someone is iconic when they are mentioned in the Mount Rushmore of conversations. Just like George Washington is on the Mount Rushmore, the godfather of our country, Royce Gracie is the godfather, the original gangster. That's his octagon.
You can't talk about the best welterweights in the world without talking about Kamaru Usman, and that's who lands at number 13 in our 30th anniversary list. The Nigerian Nightmare was introduced to the UFC audience at The Ultimate Fighter Season 21, where he showed off his dominant wrestling game. His finish at Hader Hassan in the finale sparked a 9-fight run that led him to a title shot at UFC 235 against Tyron Woodley. He left zero doubt about who the best welterweight in the world was that night. He dominated Woodley for 25 minutes, made it look easy, and this came at a time when Woodley was considered to be one of the best welterweights ever. From there, Usman's title reign began with a heated rivalry against Colby Covington. But in the 5th round of their fight at UFC 245, Usman put Covington down and out with punches to begin his title reign in an emphatic statement. He followed that up with a dominant unanimous decision win over Jorge Masvidal on Fight Island at UFC 251. From there, that's when Usman's work with his coach Trevor Whitman really began to shine. Usman became a little bit more than just a wrestler. He became a knockout artist. He finished Gilbert Burns with punches, and he followed that up with a devastating knockout of Jorge Masvidal in their rematch at UFC 261. No longer just a dominant wrestler, he was evolving, and that's something that you rarely see from a fighter 17 fights into their pro career. At UFC 268, he picked up another win over Colby Covington to record his 5th title defense. And he was 1 minute away from getting number 6 at UFC 278 in a rematch with Leon Edwards, but lightning struck. Usman would go on to lose the trilogy bout as well, but his run up to the title, his tough win, his title defenses, you have to consider him among the best to ever do it. A dominating wrestler who just smashed his opponents when he was on top. That's why he lands at number 13 in our 30th anniversary list.
Regardless of where you want to place BJ Penn on the list of the UFC's greatest fighters in its 30 years of operation, it really doesn't matter so long as we acknowledge he deserves to be on the list. When we talk about pound for pound, it's meant for the lighter weight fighters like Sugar Ray Robinson in boxing, but when it comes to MMA pound for pound, few can argue how much meaning it had when you had fighters like Penn, who were pioneers of the lighter weight divisions, but also not afraid to go all the way up to heavyweight. But when it comes to what he did inside the UFC, you can't deny his numbers. Sure, he may have some losses and a 500 record, but he always fought the best fellow legends and pound for pound greats to become just the 2nd person in UFC history to have 2 titles in 2 different divisions, competitive divisions like lightweight and welterweight. Also pulled numbers like 400K prior to Twitter and social media and ESPN and Fox and all those deals. He was getting guys like The Rock, Jason Statham to show up at shows. This guy really influenced and had reach beyond than what he's given credit for. Was talked about and left the promotion. Was talked about big boxing matches, although they didn't come to fruition. Did that and had that kind of drama before McGregor. Did the leg wrap thing before Khabib was doing it. One of the most dominant lightweights, but when it comes to lightweight legacy, none of those previously mentioned names can hold a candle, in my opinion, to what BJ Penn has done.
Coming in at number 11 is the natural Randy Couture. If you follow Randy's career outside of the cage, you know he's pretty expendable. But that couldn't be further from the truth inside the cage. Without his blood, sweat, and tears, I don't know that there's a sport that we're talking about today. The man carried the UFC on his back for many years and helped convert non-fans into casuals and casuals into hardcore fans. Couture had his first fight at UFC 13 and his last fight at UFC 129. Throughout that time, he collected 6 belts, 3 heavyweight belts, 3 light heavyweight belts, with one of them being an interim title. Now, outside of those monsters, he's had fights against Brock Lesnar, Vitor Belfort, Josh Barnett, Lyoto Machida, and who can forget his massive victory well into his 40s against Tim Silva. That might possibly be the defining moment in his UFC career.
Not bad for an old man.
He's even represented MMA against boxing. Yeah, there's a reason MMA guys get in the ring and boxers stay out of the cage these days. That all started with James Toney when he got submitted by Randy Couture in round 1 of their fight at UFC 118. Couture was also a part of the inaugural season of The Ultimate Fighter, where he coached against longtime nemesis Chuck Liddell. It's hard to point to an era of the UFC where Randy Couture didn't have his footprint. Whether it was at the front end showing wrestlers that it's possible to have a life post-wrestling, or the back end where he was showing fighters that there is a life outside of fighting. You can do analyst work, you can do television, you can do movies. Randy Couture has done them all. Randy Couture served as a bridge and inspiration for so many fighters. There isn't much Captain America hasn't done, except maybe play Captain America. Either way, this guy is still and will always be our hero, and that is why he comes in at number 11 on our list of the 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time.
OHIO. Arguably the greatest heavyweight in MMA history, is one of Cleveland's favorite sons. Stipe Miocic has his name littered throughout the UFC heavyweight record books, an impressive feat in the division that always seems most difficult to mount momentum in. He has the most wins, most finishes, and most title defenses in heavyweight history, just to name a few accolades. When Miocic entered the fray in 2011, he appeared to be a promising up-and-comer with his Crow Cop-esque Croatian shorts and finishing abilities. But would have anyone guessed he'd be a GOAT candidate? Maybe Miocic did. He suffered losses along the way, but sometimes the most successful route to the top isn't linear. Each time he lost, it made him better. At UFC 198, in May 2015, Miocic had his breakthrough moment when he silenced a stadium of Brazilians. He sent then-champion Fabricio Verdum crashing to the floor with a single punch. Title defenses against Alistair Overeem in an all-time rowdy UFC crowd in Cleveland, Junior Dos Santos in Dallas, and Francis Ngannou in Boston set him up for a super fight trilogy with Daniel Cormier. Despite a quick knockout loss the first time around, Miocic redeemed himself with 2 consecutive wins against one of his fellow all-time promotional greats. While Miocic's second title reign came crashing down with his unconscious body at the hands of Francis Ngannou at UFC 260, Miocic isn't done yet. While the world eagerly awaits the return of the man who fights fighters and fighters alike, Miocic has already secured his spot as MMA Junkie's number 10 fighter in UFC history.
When it comes to making a list of great UFC fighters, how do you leave off Alexander the Great Volkanovski? Not just at featherweight, but the man's technically competed across 4 weight classes in his MMA career, 2 weight classes in the octagon, and those 2 weight classes are very deep ones. That is featherweight and lightweight, which is technically the division he started off in the octagon at, and went back up twice to kind of moonlight up there against pound-for-pound powerhouse Islam Makhachev, not once but twice on short notice, showing that fighting spirit of previous lightweight pioneers like BJ Penn who came before him, whilst also having that kind of overall pound-for-pound technical mastery like a George St Pierre, whilst arguably delivering better than the GSP, and I'm a big GSP fan, but that's how good Alexander Volkanovski is, and that's why he deserves, without a doubt, to be on this list.
Coming in at number 8 is Amanda the Lioness Nunes, a former UFC bantamweight and featherweight champion whose resume is undeniable. Nunes is one of the few UFC dual champions that has actively defended both her titles. She beat just about every women's MMA great. I mean, you look at her resume and it's hard to argue that another female fighter has achieved more. She ran through Miesha Tate to become bantamweight champion, ran through Ronda Rousey to defend her bantamweight title, and when you look at her matchup against Chris Cyborg, she was supposed to have met her match. She walked through the fire and knocked Chris Cyborg out as well, and also knocked Holly Holm out. Now, her 2 fights with Valentina Shevchenko did not go as dominantly as the others, but still, she defeated former flyweight champion Shevchenko twice and added another great to her resume. After 2 defenses of her featherweight title, Nunes lost her bantamweight title in a shocking upset submission to Juliana Pena. She regained her bantamweight title by battering the woman who took it from her and notched one more title defense against Irene Aldana before deciding to retire. Nunes defended her bantamweight title 5 times in her first reign and defended her featherweight title twice. Nunes is not just one of the greatest female fighters, but one of the greatest fighters of all time, period.
Daniel Cormier had a distinguished wrestling career, but in mixed martial arts, DC crushed it. That is why Daniel Cormier comes in at number 7 on our list of the 30 greatest fighters in UFC history. Cormier started his MMA journey at age 30. That's kind of late in MMA, but he accomplished a lot. He won his first 15 pro fights and scooped up belts at ex-MMA and King of the Cage. But there was one other gem in that bunch that caught everyone's eye. His win in the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix. That tournament started with MMA legends like Fedor Emelianenko, Fabricio Verdum, Andrei Arlovski, Josh Barnett, and Alistair Overeem, just to name a few. But in the end, Cormier stepped up to claim the prestigious prize. After an impressive heavyweight run, DC dropped to 205 where he captured the vacant UFC light heavyweight belt over Anthony Johnson. Cormier defended that strap a few times, then decided to chase history. In July of 2018, Cormier would join the prestigious Champ Club by defeating Stipe Miocic to claim the UFC's heavyweight title. This would be the crowning achievement in DC's career. This time, the wrestler used his hands to get the job done. One of 10 fights he finished via TKO. Cormier added 2 heavyweight title defenses to his other title defenses, and this is notable. Less than half of the UFC's champs have also defended both belts. Nowadays, you can often hear the Hall of Famer as part of the UFC's #1 pay-per-view team alongside John Anik and Joe Rogan. He's smooth on the mic and always interacts nicely with fans. But make no mistake, this was a mean son of a gun back in the day. And he also fought many other legends like Jon Jones, Anderson Silva, Dan Henderson, Derek Lewis, Josh Barnett. The list goes on and on. He fought all the best. Congrats on a fabulous career, DC.
Coming in at number 6 on our list of the greatest UFC fighters of all time is none other than Jose Aldo. In a time when the UFC didn't have a featherweight division, Jose Aldo was absolutely wrecking shop in the WEC. He went 8-0, winning his featherweight title from Mike Brown. He also had wins over Uriah Faber, Manny Gambarian, and Cub Swanson. After the purchase of the WEC, the UFC absorbed a lot of their fighters, with one of them being the crown jewel, Jose Aldo. They would also anoint him the inaugural featherweight champion for the UFC. If you look up and down Aldo's record, he was tested by strikers, wrestlers, ground specialists. The challenges never ended, and Aldo never backed down. To this point, Aldo looked invincible. Enter Conor McGregor. McGregor would challenge Aldo for his title, but end up taking a lot more than gold from the King of Rio. The two engaged in a verbal war and nearly came to blows at the press conference. You could tell McGregor was in his head. The two finally met at UFC 194, and everyone had goosebumps during their intro. The fight itself didn't last too long. It only took 13 seconds for Conor McGregor to end Jose Aldo's reign of terror. This is a fight that may have changed Aldo forever. He never got his revenge with McGregor. He later went on to drop some fights to Max Holloway and now current champion Alexander Volkanovski. Jose Aldo established a legacy for lighter weight classes, much like Manny Pacquiao did in boxing. They now headline big cards and they cashed massive paychecks. Aldo will forever be known as the guy who never backed down from a challenge. He took on all competitors, in their prime no less. He's one of a kind, and that is why he is number 6 on our list of the 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time. Jose Aldo, you're a Hall of Famer, a badass, and a legend. Cheers to you.
Coming in at number 5 on our 30th anniversary list, and you knew that this name had to be somewhere around the top, Khabib Nurmagomedov. While the Eagle lands at number 5 here, the thing that he has over everybody else on this list may have him soaring a little bit higher on your own personal rankings. Khabib's the only fighter here to retire as an undefeated UFC champion, 29-0. And when he walked away, he was at the top of his game. But when he hung it up at the wish of his mother, you really got the feeling that he meant that he was done for good. And that's something very rare in a sport where retirements hardly ever stick. But when he said he was done, you really got the feeling that he was done for good. And he has since transitioned into one of the best coaches in the game. And that truly speaks to his intelligence level of knowing what's going on inside the cage as well. When he was in there himself, though, he was just next level. A dominant grappler, smothering wrestling game that nobody could stop. There were no secrets when it came to Khabib. You knew what he was going to do, and he was going to do it. And he knew that as well, and that's why he never strayed away from what he was. Even in his most heated rivalry against Conor McGregor at UFC 229, Conor tried everything to get under his skin, but it just didn't work. Khabib choked him out in the 4th round. In his next fight at UFC 242, he choked out Dustin Poirier. In his final fight at UFC 254, he choked out Justin Gaethje. An incredible run to end a legendary career that became an instant Hall of Fame career. And that's pretty rare for the UFC as well, to put someone in the Hall of Fame that quickly. But when you tuned in to watch Khabib, you knew you were watching something special. You knew you were in for a dominant display. And you knew you were watching a generational talent. And that's why he lands at number 5 in our 30th anniversary list.
Number 4, Anderson Silva. You can't possibly do a top 5 greatest UFC fighter list and not include Anderson Silva. You just can't. What Anderson Silva did was unprecedented, and we're a decade past his prime, and many of his records still stand today. We're talking about the greatest middleweight in UFC history, a man that holds the record for the most successful title defenses at 185 pounds, and a man who still holds a very prestigious record in the longest win streak in UFC history with 16 consecutive victories. He also has the most finishes in UFC middleweight history at 11 and the most finishes in UFC title fights at 9. Anderson Silva was an untouchable maestro during his time. He just simply couldn't be touched. He was unmatched. From 2006 to 2012, he enamored the MMA world more often than not by making easy work of the world's best. He defeated and and ran through fighters such as Dan Henderson, Rich Franklin, Nate Marquardt, Damian Maia, Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, Yushin Okami, Forrest Griffin, Travis Lutter, Chris Lieben, and the list goes on. But apart from the ridiculous stats, it was also how he did it. Anderson Silva didn't have all the muscles or tattoos. He was a fairly athletic looking man with a soft voice and a welcoming smile. He was the Ronaldinho of MMA. He treated elite level competition as if it were just a sparring session with the new kid from the gym, as if there was nothing on the line. He made MMA feel fun. Anderson Silva had impeccable timing and technique that was light years ahead of its time. If there was ever a fighter that made you question if the sport was rigged or not because how good they were, how easy they made it look, it was him. Words can't describe the magic and specialness of Anderson Silva's prime. And that's why he sits at number 4 on MMA Junkie's 30 greatest UFC fighters of all time.
When it comes to skill, technique, and the ability to mix up the martial arts, you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone that's ever done it better than Demetrius Johnson. Mighty Mouse was way ahead of his time as the first UFC flyweight champion in history. While perhaps he did not get the respect he deserved from the promotion, media, and fans at the time, history reflects kindly on Johnson, who went 13-1-1 from the division's implementation in 2012. He led the way in introducing fans to flyweight speed and skill, the likes the mainstream had never seen prior. He won the promotion's 4-man tournament for the inaugural strap before successful title defenses against, are you ready for this? Joseph Benavidez twice, John Dodson twice, John Moraga, Ali Bagutinov, Chris Carriasso, Kyoji Horiguchi, Henry Cejudo, Tim Elliott, Wilson Hayes, and who could forget that suplex to mid-air armbar he hit Ray Borg with. Johnson's reign looked as if it would never end, until Cejudo earned a rematch and eked out a split decision to upset and dethrone Johnson at UFC 227 in August 2018. Months later, Johnson was traded to one championship for Ben Askren in an ultra-rare inter-promotion transaction. While often criticized for his lack of draw, the world seems to have changed its tune about Johnson. As a fighter and a champion, the uneducated eyes have become wiser. The lower the weight class, the more skill, and Johnson reigns supreme as a technical fighter in the most technical weight class. Truly supreme. It wasn't easy, but Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson is number 3 on MMA Junkie's top 30 fighters in UFC history.
From the moment he first appeared inside the octagon, it was clear Jon Jones wasn't an ordinary talent. And the more we watched him, it became obvious he was extraordinary. His freakishly long limbs and natural athleticism made Jones unique from the jump, but it was the way he utilized those gifts that made him an immediate contender in the UFC light heavyweight division. Jones ran through his first batch of opponents inside the octagon with minimal training experience and implemented techniques in his fights that he picked up from watching YouTube videos. Within 8 UFC appearances, Jones achieved an unprecedented accomplishment. At age 23, he became the youngest champion the UFC had ever seen, a record that still stands to this day when he ruthlessly defeated the legendary Shogun Rua at UFC 128, March 2011. That truly kickstarted one of the greatest careers the sport has ever seen. Over the next 9 years, Jones would rack up a record 14 title fight victories at 205 pounds, dispatching of some of the UFC's all-time greats, from Daniel Cormier to Rampage Jackson to Glover Teixeira, and everyone notable in between. The tail end of his light heavyweight run left something to be desired, however, and that's what finally prompted Jones to make a long-awaited, highly anticipated jump up to heavyweight. It was at heavyweight that Jones put an undeniable stamp on his legacy. He claimed the vacant heavyweight belt in March 2023, placing him on the short list of fighters to win UFC titles in 2 different divisions. There have been few flaws from Jones inside the octagon, and the only real damage to his legacy has come outside the cage. Numerous personal indiscretions, a complicated association with drug tests, and lots of time off has hindered Jones's reputation in the eyes of some. and that's ultimately might be why he doesn't land at number 1 on this list. Even with all that, though, Jones has done enough work to be considered one of the greatest ever, and the good thing for him is he still has more time to work.
Coming in at number 1 is George St Pierre. When looking at the perfect example in and out of the octagon, look no further than George Rush St Pierre, who retired on top with a record of 26-2, 2 losses that came to Matt Hughes and Matt Serra, which he later avenged by finish. St Pierre defended his welterweight title a record of 9 times, including wins over Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz, Jake Shields, Josh Koscheck, Dan Hardy, Thiago Alves, BJ Penn, and John Fitch. After defending his title against Johnny Hendricks, a split decision at UFC 167, one that was questioned by many, he decided to vacate his belt and walk away from the sport. But even if St Pierre walked away at that point, there was no denying his greatness. But if there was one asterisk, one criticism towards St Pierre's career was that he never moved up a weight class or challenged himself in a different weight class. Well, he put those criticisms to rest when he returned 4 years later and challenged then-champion Michael Bisping for the middleweight title. St Pierre versus Bisping headlined UFC 217 at Madison Square Garden in New York, and St Pierre ended up submitting Bisping to win the middleweight title and retire on top. Incredible career for GSP, somebody who had great MMA wrestling, arguably the best, or one of the best in UFC history, and he didn't even come from a wrestling background. Whether it was against Josh Koscheck using his jab, or whether it was his wrestling to suffocate the likes of Nick Diaz, GSP is undeniably one of the most well-rounded fighters in the history of the UFC.